Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Saanvi Arora. I'm a senior at UC Berkeley. I'm studying computer science, legal studies, and public policy, and I'm also the outgoing external affairs vice president for our student body here at UC Berkeley. Today I'm here with Jelani Nelson, a Redeem professor in the EECS department here at UC Berkeley, to discuss high school math as it pertains to college admissions and readiness in the state of California. Jelani, do you want to introduce yourself really quick?
Sure. Yeah, as you said, thank you. I'm Jelani. I'm a professor here in the computer science division in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences. I'm the chair of the CS division, and I'll start as department chair this summer. Just a disclaimer, everything I say today is just kind of my own individual opinion. You shouldn't take it as, I'm not representing the official opinion of UC or the Berkeley campus.
Well, thank you. I think today we're going to be talking a lot about ongoing discussions in the state legislature around A through G requirements for UC admissions. But to get us started, I think it'd be good to introduce what A through G requirements are and how data science fits into this. So what are the A through G requirements and how does data science fit into this?
Sure. So there are minimum requirements for freshman admission to the University of California. It applies to all 9 undergraduate serving campuses. And they're called the A through G requirements because they're basically a pointer, a link into the faculty regulations, so what we call the Academic Senate regulations. The Academic Senate is just UC jargon for the body of all professors across the system. And it's Senate Regulation 424.A.3, sections A through G. Each one of those sections, A through G, is a different subject area. So for example, B is science, C is math, E is foreign languages, and so forth. And they just specify what kids need to take in high school to be ready for a college education at UC, and they also apply to Cal State as well.
Well, thank you. I think a lot of our conversation is going to hinge on the importance of Algebra 2 as one of the A through G requirements. So I'd love for you to kind of expand on the importance of Algebra 2, particularly in the context of students who want to study STEM or any quantitative fields.
Yeah. Sure. So yeah, just going back to these A through G requirements, as we mentioned, C is math. And specifically, it says it's required to take 3 years of math in high school to be eligible for UC or Cal State admission. And those 3 years have to, in aggregate, cover the contents of Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2. And those are defined in the state standards of what exactly is in those courses. So you mentioned why Algebra 2. This has been going back for decades now in the Area C requirement that the UC has mandated what they called advanced algebra, which is basically the UC jargon word for Algebra 2. I can talk about my own teaching. I teach an undergraduate algorithms course. Algebra 2 pops up even in lecture 1 for me. So Algebra 2 contains things like manipulation of polynomials, polynomial algebra, also geometric series. Actually, I have the Algebra 2 standards printed out right in front of me. So let me just go through some of them. So the complex number system, I cover the fast Fourier transform in my class, CS170. You might not know what that is, that's fine. But what you might know about is string matching, right? So you have a long text document, a Google Doc, a Word document, and you want to find, you want to do a Control F search for a small text pattern that appears somewhere in your document. Find it for me. And maybe your search pattern has wildcards in it that can match any character. It turns out that I'm not gonna teach you undergrad algorithms today in this video, but it turns out that you can treat a string of letters, like a text, as a vector of numbers. Change A to 1, B to 2, C to 3, A through Z gets mapped to 1 to 26. Treat a wildcard as a 0, for example. So you have a vector of numbers. You have another vector of numbers, which is the longer Google Doc. And there's a way to represent these vectors as polynomials, and then basically do some polynomial multiplications to quickly find instances of the small pattern in the larger text using things like the fast Fourier transform. So I cover that in my class, which is linear algebra in it. It has complex numbers in it. It has polynomials in it. You know, also geometric series is in Algebra 2. You know, have you taken CS 170?
I'm about to.
You're about to take CS 170. Okay. So CS 170 is our introductory algorithms course here. And, you know, we teach students how to design algorithms and also how to analyze algorithms. And one of the first things we teach students to analyze algorithms is the master theorem, which is a theorem that allows you to analyze how fast or slow an algorithm is that uses recursion, essentially. Let me not get into the jargon too much in this video, but you know, in that analysis, you have to, you know, geometric series pop up, change of base formulas for logarithms pop up. Logarithms, again, that's a special function that's covered in Algebra 2. So, and you have to, you know, I guess that's already, now we've done like 2 different sections of Algebra 2 in the first few lectures. Actually 3, because arithmetic with polynomials is also part of FFT. You know, that's just my one class. You talk about modern day machine learning, you know, people have probably heard of ChatGPT. What does the T in ChatGPT stand for? It stands for transformer. What is a transformer? A transformer is a deep learning neural net architecture that's built on something called the attention mechanism. What is the attention mechanism? The attention mechanism, to define it, you would need to understand exponential function. It uses something called the softmax. To define that, you would need to know something about the exponential function, about linear algebra, because it's defined in terms of matrices as well. And if you want to train these models, you know, if you're OpenAI or you're Google, or you want to train Gemini, or you want to train GPT-4, these models, you need to use backpropagation and things like gradient descent, optimization techniques. That's all multivariable calculus. You can't really even talk about those things until you talk about gradients, and gradients are an object from multivariable calculus, which is several years later after Algebra 2. So Algebra 2 is, Algebra 2, then pre-calc, then single variable calculus, then multivariable calculus, right? So kind of a lot of modern algorithms, machine learning, are really built on Algebra 2 and things beyond it.
No, absolutely. I think it's like undoubtedly important for STEM majors, folks who are interested in computer science and folks who are interested in going into this field or technical field, to have a strong math foundation. But, you know, for members of our audience who might, you know, not resonate with that, who might, you know, be in a non-STEM background, why is it important to have a strong math foundation, especially in Algebra 2?
Yeah, I mean, the reason, I guess, kind of alluding to what I said before about my lectures, is just kind of the language of STEM is math, right? You just can't even begin to think about a lot of the ideas that modern day computer science and other STEM fields are based on without the language of mathematics and things like Algebra 2 and beyond. Maybe just to plug 2 things. One is, and you know, this is just to show this is not just my opinion. There's something called ICUS, which is the Intersegmental Committee of the Academic Senates. This is a body, this is a committee that has faculty representation from all 3 public segments, so Cal State, UC, and California Community Colleges. Mm-hmm. And they put out a statement just a month or 2 months ago on math competency, where they talked about kind of what we, the institutes of higher education, public institutes of higher education across California, believe students need in terms of math prep to succeed in higher ed at all 3 segments. And they reiterate the same kinds of things for STEM students, and they also have guidance for non-STEM as well, for arts and humanities, for social sciences. And one more thing I'll plug is, you know, there was actually, we'll get to this soon, I guess, but kind of the UC reaffirmed, you know, its desire to uphold these standards about 2 years ago in a July 2023 resolution. And that decision was praised by experts in industry. So there was a letter from people in industry that was signed by people like Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, and leaders from Google and Facebook, Apple, NVIDIA, and so forth, that said, yes, in industry we actually really use these foundational math topics.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for sharing all that really helpful information about kind of what Algebra 2 even covers. I know that in my legal studies classes and economics classes, like Algebra 2 is like a baseline for everything that we learn. So I know that both in STEM and non-STEM fields, it's incredibly important. At the same time, a lot of high schools, in trying to meet A through G requirements and trying to offer a robust math curriculum, are starting to diversify the ways that they meet Algebra 2 requirements for college admissions. And one of these, like one of the ways that they're doing that is by also offering data science courses as a supplement for Algebra 2. So what exactly is data science, and do you think the high school data science courses adequately teach foundations of math and logic in the same way that Algebra 2 does?
Yeah, I mean, so what is data science? Data science is concerned with how to extract knowledge from data broadly, using tools from statistics, mathematics, and computer science, algorithms, computation. And you said some high schools are using it to kind of replace or to supplement Algebra 2. I guess there are a few things to say about that. So just going back to the A through G requirements, I mentioned that the reason they're called A through G is because they're part of academic senate regulations. So at the UC, it's the regents that have ultimate authority. The Board of Regents has the ultimate authority over the university. They're the main governing body. And when it comes to admission requirements, they delegate the management of that to the faculty. And we have our own faculty government and our own committees that deal with that. And of course, the faculty, are trying to make sure that the requirements are there to maximize success of students when they get to college, so that they're ready to do the work when they get here in our courses to succeed. And your question of data science as Algebra 2, there is another regulation in our academic senate regulations called 428.c. It's an exception regulation, and what it says is, it's not just the math, it's like all the different subject areas. You don't necessarily have to take a required class if you take a more advanced class that builds on that required class and uses knowledge from the required class. And when this was introduced, this exception clause, it was originally introduced for the purpose of the foreign language requirement, which is Area E. And the idea is, look, if a kid already knows some Spanish, they don't necessarily have to come in taking Spanish 1, they could take Spanish 3, and the UC is okay with that because it's more advanced than and uses knowledge from Spanish 1. And actually the word the UC uses is validation, and it's the common English word validate. What's being validated is the mastery of the lower level required coursework. So the fact that a student was able to take Spanish 3 and get an A validates their mastery of Spanish 1. And so that's the foreign language requirement, but you can apply this kind of validation logic to other areas as well, like math. So like pre-calculus validates, it's approved as validating Algebra 2. Calculus is approved as validating Algebra 2. So students can take that if they skip Algebra 2. Now at some point, and this is slightly hazy, at some point that was probably 15 plus years ago, and before I say this, so there's the regents which have delegated authority mostly to the faculty on this, although they have to approve what the faculty do, but the faculty are the ones who really manage it. The faculty is kind of the policy-making body here. But there's separately an implementation office, a staff office. And their job is to take the policy that the faculty have made, approved by the regents, and to implement it. And what does that mean, implement it? It means if I'm a high school, I'm Berkeley High, I want to teach a particular curriculum and I want it to count for the Algebra 2 requirement or for some other requirement. I have to prepare some paperwork, some syllabus and so forth. I have to submit that to this staff office, and that staff office has to then check it against the policy and see whether it satisfies the policy or not. Okay, so that process is not, they can be overseen by the faculty, but usually they do their work on their own. And at some point, like 15 plus years ago, that staff office approved some statistics courses as satisfying the exception clause, as validating Algebra 2. And in many cases, most cases was erroneous. The courses that they were approving didn't actually build on Algebra 2 and assume knowledge from Algebra 2. So passing those statistics courses didn't actually validate mastery of Algebra 2. Contrary to our own regulations, contrary to the state standards for college readiness approved by the State Board of Education. But even though that erroneous approval happened, it's actually, you mentioned schools doing this. It was actually a path that was very rarely taken. The vast majority of schools were not doing this. We're talking about 15 plus years ago. So, let's say the early 2010s. And at some point, UC pulled the data, and I think in fall 2022, you looked at all the kids who applied fall 2022 for freshman admission, something like 0.16% had taken statistics or data science, but did not take Algebra 2 and applied for freshman admission at some UC. Out of 250,000 applicants, there were about 400 who were in that bucket. So it was a very tiny fraction. But it existed. It was a non-zero fraction, but very tiny. And you mentioned data science. So I think the first course, data science, high school data science course that was approved this way erroneously was 2013. It's called Introduction to Data Science, or IDS. What was your question? Was your question, are they appropriate as Algebra 2 replacements, or what's missing? Is that the question?
Yeah, what's missing? How do these proposed courses maybe cover Algebra 2? How do they not?
Yeah. So the analogy I like to give, because I think what's gotten lost in a lot of this debate, this public policy debate and this conversation, is the UC has never said anything that's anti-data science, even counting as Algebra 2. It's more that, look, I think we all know that second graders take English class, 11th and 12th graders take English class. Both of those classes are called English. But a second grade English class and a 12th grade English class are not the same thing. And same thing with data science. Data science is this very broad subject, and you can imagine data science courses, even if they are for high school, meaning covering different things. And similarly, you could also have kind of lower level data science courses appropriate for middle school or early high school versus appropriate for 11th and 12th grade. Algebra 2 is an 11th grade course. And I think the fact of the matter is the two most popular high school data science courses in the state of California don't come anywhere close to being an Algebra 2 substitute. They don't assume knowledge from Algebra 2 or mastery of Algebra 2 content. They don't cover Algebra 2 content, and they don't pretend to either. There's an article, the guy who made Introduction to Data Science, IDS, he wrote an article about his own course. It's called Toward Data Scientific Thinking. And he talks about his own course. He says, it has just a dash of mathematics, just a dash of mathematical thinking. He says, he has a section in this paper that says something like, mathematics is less important than one might think. So, there's actually a separate email he sent at some point where he said he designed his course for 9th and 10th graders, right? Where Algebra 2 is an 11th grade course. How could it cover the same content or be more advanced if he himself is saying it's for 9th graders? So it's not that data science can't serve that purpose. It's just that it just so happens that the most popular data science curricula that have been deployed don't. And I think lately that's been changing. So there are some high schools as recently as last year, after this debate had already begun, which started deploying data science curricula that actually do cover Algebra 2 content or integrated math 3 content. So for example, I looked it up in the UC database, which is public, anyone can do this. There's a course called Integrated Math 3, a Data Science Approach. It covers the content of Math 3, which is, in the integrated sequence, it's like the Algebra 2 parallel. This course is taught at Rio Mesa High School in the Oxnard Union High School District. It's taught at Mission Vista High School in the Vista Unified School District. And it's been approved by UC correctly as satisfying our third-year math requirement, the Algebra 2 requirement. So they can exist, and they do exist. It's just that the most popular curricula in this space weren't serving that purpose.
No, that's really helpful to hear. I think that one counter argument that you hear a lot from folks in the space is that, the student equity and achievement point that, offering data science as an alternative to traditional Algebra 2 levels the playing field, especially thinking about how there's plenty of students who are applying to the University of California, applying to college, who might not necessarily be interested in STEM. And so what do you think about kind of that argument around leveling the playing field? Is it really that important for even students who are going into non-STEM fields to satisfy like robust Algebra 2 requirements? Or do you think data science is, data science, regardless of the amount of math that it uses, is an appropriate substitution for those students?
Yeah, I think we have to be a little bit careful. First of all, just this idea that some students are STEM students and some are not. I don't know, do you know anyone who's changed their major?
I mean, I'm legal studies and computer science. I've known plenty of people that changed their majors. I've changed my majors several times.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you've changed your, you said have changed your major several times.
I've changed my major. Well, it hasn't been between CS. I've always been a CS major, but I've changed between legal studies and not legal studies and public policy and all these other degrees so many times.
Right. So, I mean, I think that, the worry is when you talk about leveling the playing field. So there are some people who view math as a gatekeeper, right? It's like if only there weren't this, particular math requirement, Algebra 2, whatever it may be, then the student would be able to access their, they'd be able to get admitted to UC or Cal State and so forth. Or even once you get into university, there are some classes that people view as gatekeeper classes where if only this class were taught differently or didn't exist, it wasn't a requirement, more students would be able to complete the computer science major, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, the reality is you can't just write someone off as not being STEM because some people discover interest in STEM later, right? Mm-hmm. Like who's taken a mechanical engineering class in high school? Nobody. Like, they don't really... A high school student might not even realize what that is. Even computer science, I had a computer science class in high school. I was lucky, but it was very different from what I found out computer science really was all about once I got to college, right? Mm-hmm. And I really kind of fell in love with it more. I mean, I liked it already before college, but I really fell in love with it more after college. So I think we want to make sure that students have the basic foundations so that when they get to college, doors aren't closed off to them. And I worry, like, let me quote, again from this paper about one of these data science courses, one quote that, this curriculum, quote, is not intended as a curriculum for elite schools or elite students. And then there's another quote just slightly later, the existence of alternative pathways is important because Algebra 2 has a high failure rate, which has fueled an industry in remedial math education, and the failure rate is disproportionately high for African American and Latinx students. And then it says, data science courses, as well as statistics courses, have an important role to play. So what's the role? The suggestion here is basically, look, there's this math class, Algebra 2, which many people are not succeeding at. Many kids are failing in certain groups. Let's take those kids who are failing this math class. Let's put them instead in kind of this other curriculum that has just a dash of math, and then they'll be able to pass because it's an easier class. They'll get higher GPAs and higher graduation rates. But like what's missing from that reasoning is, okay, but then they want to get to college. Are they prepared? Are they going to be able to succeed and complete, let's say, a data science degree, which, a data science degree at every UC requires calculus. All but one require multivariable calculus at some point. Are they going to be able to complete a computer science degree and so forth, right? Or have you closed doors for them because you've set them off track into a path where they're not going to be able to get that kind of early foundational education?
No, absolutely. And I think like there's also the social emotional learning piece of this, where if you silo students off based on their supposed ability to perform well in Algebra 2 and then give them lesser opportunities or let them kind of write off those classes instead of understanding why they're failing those classes in the first place, what the education system could be doing better. You're punishing those students as opposed to punishing or really fixing constructively the systems that are causing a disproportionate amount of BIPOC students to not succeed in those classes. So I think there's an important argument to be made that you're actually just setting up, these students to face future disparities in higher education, closing off doors implicitly by kind of relegating responsibility around succeeding in Algebra 2, kind of just like using another class as an excuse to not fix the problem.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing. You can see I brought up this letter that's signed by, this is an alumni club here at UC Berkeley, BSAC, the Black Engineering and Science Alumni Club. You know, when UC was debating whether to, uphold, the Algebra 2 standards as part of the admission requirement, a letter was written, this is about a year and a half ago, by the full board of BSAC, this Black Engineering and Scientist Alumni Club. And I just highlighted a part of it. This is the president speaking of BSAC. I am writing to express the opinion of our organization that this substitution of data science courses lacking the rigor of Algebra 2, which is required to prepare all students for enrollment in higher level courses such as calculus, is unwarranted and unwise and potentially harmful to underrepresented or socioeconomically disadvantaged students. So, this is the opinion of our alums, our Black alums at UC Berkeley, which I agree with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we've talked about a lot of really great things here. Can you tell us about who's pushing for this change exactly and who's pushing to substitute Algebra 2 with data science at the high school level?
Yeah, I think there are a few different parties with different motivations. I think there are some people who are genuinely very excited by the idea of diverse math pathways in high school. The details, of course, matter though, right? There are some people pushing for this who have made the curriculum themselves, and that to me feels a little icky to me, because you want to make sure that you have good processes and minimize kind of conflicts of interest and self-dealing. So for example, the two most popular high school data science curricula in the state, I mentioned one of them had early on gotten this erroneous approval by the staff office, and the creator noticed that. And kind of what was the creator's response to that years later? Serve on a committee to advise the UC Office of the President to try to cement this erroneous approval into policy, right? And to me, that's, there's even an email that this person wrote to the creator of the second most popular high school data science curriculum, where he says this, he says, there's a real possibility that my course would lose this approval. So I got on this committee and drafted a new policy, to protect the erroneous approval, right? And that just doesn't sound like a good process. Do you want people who are, and this course, by the way, I should mention, charges districts money to train teachers. It used to charge almost $10,000 per teacher for 13 days of training. I think today it doesn't charge because it got funding from some private foundation that covers all the costs, but someone's paying still. And so to have someone who kind of has that vested interest running an enterprise that generates this kind of substantial revenue, trying to rewrite admissions policy to be friendly to their own curriculum, somehow it doesn't sound right. It sounds like that's not how a process should work. And who was that email sent to? That email was sent in 2020 to someone who at the time was co-authoring state guidelines for K-12 math teaching, the so-called California Math Framework. And within 1 month of receiving that email, that person released her own high school data science curriculum, which to this day charges something like $1,800 per teacher for 2 days of training. A UC committee that evaluated her curriculum said it uses the least math of all the curricula they reviewed, and doesn't come close to being an advanced math class. So, right? And then 2 months after she released her curriculum, they then released the state guidelines that she was co-authoring, which promoted his class and her class by name in the first draft. So, I think we need there are stronger conflict of interest rules, both at the UC and at the Department of Education and the State Board of Education, to make sure that people who have these kind of vested interests don't have kind of undue influence over our public processes or state processes. So that's the second group. You asked who are the groups of people kind of pushing this. The third group of people, and this is more kind of my speculation, I don't have hard evidence, but it's even in that document that I read from that says, look, you have certain groups of people who are failing at higher rates. This could be a solution, put them in my curriculum, right? And so who is that kind of messaging appealing to? It's appealing to school administrators, right? Education bureaucrats, right? The idea is like, look, administrators and bureaucrats get rewarded for having better performance. My kids in my school have higher GPAs, they have higher graduation rates and so forth. So it's like this magic potion, right? It's how can I fix the fact that some of my kids in my schools are not doing so well? Actually really improving performance is hard work, right? It's hard, it's unclear maybe how to proceed and be effective. But if I have this magic potion, I can just take those kids and put them in this other curriculum that's substandard, right? That's easier. All of a sudden, all my stats will get hacked. I'll get better GPAs, I'll get better graduation rates, and I can claim victory, right? But in my opinion, it's really a false victory because you're really kind of shifting the goalposts.
No, absolutely. And I think that's kind of why the state legislature is also looking into this. There's been a huge misinterpretation of what it means to change policy versus what it means to fix an erroneous implementation of a policy, right? And I think I know that there's a lot that the California State Legislature has been investigating with regards to this overall topic. So I do want to provide a little context to that. How did we get here?
Yeah, so 2 years ago, March 2023, Cal State was the first to sound the alarm, like, hey, UC, did you guys realize that you erroneously approved these courses? And they passed a formal resolution, a committee called APEP, which represents all 23 Cal State campuses, faculty at all campuses passed that resolution. And then within a few months of that, UC, they got that resolution and they got other input. And a UC faculty committee that's advisory on admissions requirements called BORS, they were like, yeah, Cal State, all other people sounding the alarm, you're right. These courses don't actually align with our own regulations. The erroneous approvals are hereby revoked. And on top of revoking, that was July 2023. On top of revoking the erroneous approvals, they convened an ad hoc committee of experts, including one of the co-creators of Data 8, who's Ani Adhikari. She was the chair of that committee, that work group, and they spent a year kind of doing a deep dive and writing 2 reports, and they affirmed the decision. And I think what was confusing there is, there had been this kind of long, like 10 to 15-ish years of these courses being erroneously approved. But again, very, very few schools were actually making use of this, right? Very few schools realized that these courses could be used for Algebra 2. And as soon as UC found out, they revoked it. And I think some people who maybe didn't understand the UC process as well looked at that and then said, UC just changed its policy. And they didn't change policy, they enforced policy. They said, this thing happened that was contrary to our policies, contrary to the state standards for college readiness. We're going to fix it, and we're going to enforce policy, and we're going to revoke these erroneous approvals. And the legislature somehow came to believe that enforcement of policy was actually a change of policy, which it wasn't. Because to change policy, there's a long bureaucratic process at the UC, which involves the regents. And that didn't happen because there was no change. It was an enforcement. And the regents agree with me. I have a letter. Let me just say, there was a hearing, a joint hearing in October last year, so less than a year ago, joint between the Assembly Higher Education Committee, that's chaired by Mike Fong, and the Assembly Education Committee, chaired by Al Muratsuchi. It was roughly a 3-hour hearing, and the whole premise was like, how dare the UC make this change? They didn't consult Cal State. Data science is so important for AI jobs and data science jobs. What about equity and so forth? And they were really grilling the UC for those 3 hours. And I happened to know that this hearing was happening, so I drove to Sacramento and I gave my 2 minutes of public comment. And I said, look, you guys got this all wrong. I said, how can you say we didn't consult Cal State? Cal State is the one that passed the resolution asking the UC to revoke these courses. So yes, we consulted Cal State. They told us to do this. That's one. 2, you say this is important for AI jobs. There's this letter signed by Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, leadership from Google, Microsoft, Meta, Tesla, NVIDIA, Apple, Airbnb, and so forth, kind of a lot of the big players, senior vice presidents for machine learning at Apple, and chief scientist of Meta, chief scientist of NVIDIA, chief scientist of Google, and so forth, all saying we applaud the UC for making this decision, for revoking these courses, and for upholding the state standards, and saying we would never want to hire kids who don't have the proper math foundations. The AI experts are telling us they don't want to hire these kids if they don't have the proper training. So like, why is the legislature pushing this? And I made the point. I said, look, this entire hearing, you were so focused on this decision the UC made to uphold its own standards and your own standards, the standards of the state board. There was little mention of kind of how these courses got approved in the first place, and the fact that kind of curriculum developers were put into these places of kind of undue influence over process, and the fact that we really need stronger conflict of interest policies governing our processes. And in fact, there was actually a bill, Senate Bill 1412 last year, that was introduced by Senator Ochoa Bogue, which did exactly that. It improved conflict of interest policies to make sure that curriculum creators and those generating revenue from curricula are not able to be put in positions of influence over state guidelines. And that bill actually passed unanimously in both those committees. I told them that. I said, look, you guys even agreed because you voted for this. Assembly Education, Assembly Higher Education, it passed unanimously in both of your committees, only to be later vetoed by the governor's office. And I think the governor got bad advice, honestly. So, if you have issues, please talk to the governor. Don't talk to the UC. Anyway, after that hearing, I got 2 hours of meetings with staffers in both committees, and I walked them through the details. I said, look, I explained to them why a lot of the stuff they were saying was just incorrect. They thanked me. I even asked them, I said, you're the legislature. Why are you holding this oversight hearing? The legislature introduces bills. You make laws. You're lawmakers. That's what you do. Are you trying to set the stage to introduce some laws soon? No, Jelani. Nobody's talking about any bills or anything. And then a few months later, there's this letter, by the chairs of those committees, Muratsuchi and Fong, written to the Board of Regents. It's dated February 3rd, 2025, kind of repeating the same erroneous things. UC Boars has unanimously voted to exclude data science as advanced math for the purposes of admission. Such an exclusion constitutes a change. No, there was no change. And B, actually there was no such vote. Boars did not vote to exclude data science and statistics. They said currently approved data science courses are revoked, because at the time when they made that vote, July 2023, at the time, there were no currently approved data science courses that actually covered Algebra 2, right? So those ones are revoked. Now there are, and the ones that do cover it are approved, okay? So all they were saying was, if you want to have a data science course that is actually approved for Algebra 2, it has to cover Algebra 2. That's all they said, right? And now there are, and they're approved. So shortly after this letter was written, the regents responded, and the regents said, no, this is a mistake. There was no change. There's just an enforcement of policy. But anyway, the legislature just kind of pretended to play deaf and didn't pay attention. And soon after the letter, there were a few bills proposed. One of them is Assembly Bill 1217. And it was introduced by Fong, who's a chair of higher ed. Later, Muratsuchi joined as a co-author of the bill. And basically what it says is, we want UC and Cal State to align their admission requirements with the state standards produced by the State Board of Education. Okay, that's the main point of the bill. Okay, so what's so interesting about that bill? What do I find interesting about that bill? So if you look at the state standards in math for college readiness as they are today, they were adopted more than a decade ago. And you look at the Area C requirements for UC and Cal State admission, which is the math requirements, they are identical. Today, they are identical. They both say 3 years, cover the contents of Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2. So then someone might think, oh, if they're identical, what's the big deal? We're just codifying, existing practices and codifying existing regulations. But that's not true. So first of all, it's a bit circular. It's a bit circular to say that UC and Cal State should bring their admissions requirements to match whatever the state board says. And it's circular because where did those state board standards come from in the first place? There's no regular process there's no regular interval of time by which standards get renewed. It kind of happens whenever the legislature directs the state board to do so. And if you look at the last time they directed the state board to do so in various disciplines, for example, world languages, the legislature in the education code said to the state board, we want you to come up with new standards for world languages by 2009. Okay, and if you look at the ed code, what did they tell the state board to do? They said, state board, make sure that your standards align with the UC and Cal State admission requirements, right? So in the past, the legislature used to believe that the purpose of K-12 was to prepare some kids for college, at least the ones who are college bound, to prepare them for college. So AB 1217 is not maintaining that practice. It's kind of turning it completely upside down, and it's inverting the standard. It's inverting the way things usually work. And this actually aligns with something that Assemblywoman Sharp-Collins said in the higher education hearing on AB 1217 in April 8th. She said, we need to make sure our K-12 system is preparing kids for college, not telling college, come down and meet the needs of K-12. And she actually refused. She declined to give her aye vote for the bill in that hearing. I was there. I testified in opposition. And she's right. I mean, even historically, that's how the legislature has operated. The legislature has said, yes, we want to make sure that K-12 is meeting the needs of higher ed and preparing kids for higher ed, not telling higher ed, kind of dumb down your admission requirements to meet the needs of K-12, right? So I think the bill is completely an inversion of kind of the standard mode of operation. It's not codifying existing practices. And the worry there is if you say that, and then of course next year, let's say it passes, next year the legislature will say, okay, now state board, make new math standards, right? And now, they're going to make their own math standards, and then UC and Cal State will have to bring it down. And if you look at the state board, I mean, they have a lot of K-12 expertise, right? If you look at their committees, the IQC, the CFCCs, and so forth, they have a lot of teachers. They have very limited expertise when it comes to higher education, because that's not their domain, right? Why should they be expected to understand the needs of higher ed? That's not the purpose of their body. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me that you would move that kind of decision making for higher ed out of higher ed and move it down to a policy body that has very limited understanding of higher ed. So I think AB 1217 is really just bad legislation.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge issue. What do you think people should do about this? Why should we care?
Yeah, why should we care? I mean, actually, I went to testify April 30th in Sacramento before the Assembly Education Committee. And shortly before I got there, I found out that an opposition letter was submitted against the bill by a church deacon in Los Angeles, Deacon Wilson. He's at, I think, West Angeles Church. He runs something called the Education Enrichment Program, which is an after-school program where he mentors youth. And his letter, he said, look, I've been doing this for 25 years. I've mentored thousands of kids over the years to help them get into college, mostly UCs and CSUs. And mostly kids from the inner city, mostly Black and Latino kids. And what he said was he noticed a trend recently. He noticed that many of his kids started telling him, and the parents started telling him, hey, my guidance counselor has been pushing me to not take Algebra 2, but to take one of these new kind of curricula instead. What do you think? And it was one of these, curricula that kind of UC and Cal State was saying doesn't align with standards, is substandard, doesn't prepare kids for college. And I think there's a real worry there that kids are being misled, and maybe even the teachers are being misled and don't realize that they're off-ramping kids from college readiness. And I pointed out in my testimony that day something that I found in Ed Code, in California law, education code. It's section 66204A. There shall be no policy or practice in any public school which pushes kids away from choosing programs that prepare that pupil academically for college. Okay, and what he described in his letter sounded a lot like that. It sounded like that's happening at some schools today. And I think that's a problem. And so that's why you should care. And in terms of what you should do, talk to people in your district, talk to your teachers, make sure that they're aware of kind of what the experts are saying about these courses, including the industry letter I mentioned, signed by AI leaders and data science leaders across the state, CEOs, CTOs, senior vice presidents of major companies telling us that no, foundational math is still important. Tell your elected representatives, look up, you can look online, you can Google and see who is my representative in the state assembly, who is my representative in the state senate, and for all of them have websites where you can contact their staff and make sure this is on their radar, that they know that there are bills kind of being discussed right now like AB 1217, which I think would be a negative for students.
No, absolutely. And what steps would you recommend to ensure that high school students who are interested in tech or computing jobs or even research are adequately prepared to engage with a data-driven world while still getting a solid foundation in math?
Yeah, well, I think that the last thing you said is really important. Make sure you get a solid foundation in math. I think, decades ago when the calculator was invented, there were people who thought, oh, we have the calculator now. We don't need to teach kids arithmetic anymore. They have calculators, right? And I hear a lot of similar things now with, computing and data science and so forth. It's like, well, we have ChatGPT now, and we have computers that can run programs for us now. Like, why do kids need math anymore, right? And the reality is that all these modern innovations and the innovations that I'm sure will come in the future are using more and more math and more sophisticated math. And if you want to be at the forefront of that and be prepared to innovate in this space and have successful careers in computing and data science, it's important to have really strong math foundations.
No, absolutely. And I think even the equity piece of this, there's nuance to how people are discussing this with regards to competing narratives around equity. I mean, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it I think is just misinformation, and not always intentional, but sometimes just people who might be well-intentioned who just don't know better. I've heard claims like, I've been to Sacramento a few times now to talk about these issues, mm-hmm. and I've heard claims like, what about the under-resourced high schools that can't afford, that don't offer Algebra 2, and this is their only way to satisfy the A through G requirements? So I got the data. Mm-hmm. There are only 12 high schools in the state of California that have A through G lists that don't offer Algebra 2 or equivalent. Only 12 don't offer Algebra 2 or equivalent. Of those 12, do you want to guess how many offer data science or statistics?
Zero
do, right?
Zero.
So this worry about these, under-resourced high schools that can only offer data science or stats but can't offer Algebra 2 is a completely unfounded worry. That high school doesn't exist in the state of California. And I've read for you the BSAC letter. There was also a letter by the majority of black faculty across the UC system in fields closest to data science. That's math, data science, statistics, computer science. That said the same thing, that we're worried that kids are going to get derailed into this lower track. There's a lot of talk, we didn't talk about this today, but there's this term called tracking. I don't know if you've heard that term, mm-hmm. when it comes to especially math education in K-12, mm-hmm. where the idea is, there are some schools where, the description is, there's some schools where some kids are identified as talented or gifted and they're given access to higher quality math education, and there are some kids who are less gifted, who are hopeless, and they're put into lower tracks. This is kind of the cartoon version of it, lower tracks that are kind of dead ends. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a real and tracking has been a very hot button topic, where there are a lot of pro-equity minded people say that they're against tracking because black students and Latino students are disproportionately put in the lower tracks and given kind of worse quality math experiences in K-12. And I think there's a real worry that the same thing can happen with these substandard data science curricula. Again, there can be good ones that actually align with the state standards for college readiness, but the most popular ones in the state don't. And there's a worry that we're going to see what's happening with the Deacon's mentees. Deacon Wilson was talking about his mostly black and brown students getting funneled into these substandard curricula. Right. And it's kind of the same worry that detracking advocates are pointing to, where, look, we have a situation where these curricula might become the lower track, which is, again, anti-equity, right? So I think that's something very important to keep in mind.
No, absolutely. And I think, obviously, like, this really does shift the burden away from, our legislators and our school districts from providing quality access to Algebra 2 education, and instead offering them, a get out of jail free card in terms of, like, offering substandard forms of education that continue to marginalize their students that are already, unable to access or facing difficulties in access, like accessing robust math education. So I think what you're saying about equity makes a lot of sense and is entirely correct. I mean, I think that also, one other thing that we covered today that was really important is that Algebra 2 and having a foundational math education in high school, like, is incredibly important. And, what you said about Assemblywoman Sharp-Collins's comment that, our university, our K through 12 institutions should be preparing our children for college, not our colleges shouldn't be, like, dumbing down
exactly to meet failures, in K-12.
Exactly.
I mean, I think, you're right. We really need to hold our leaders accountable, leaders in the Department of Education and the State Board of Education, as well as elected officials in the legislature and so forth. It's not acceptable to say, look, we have these failures in preparing kids in math in high school, so we're gonna kind of invent this kind of magic potion solution where we funnel kids into substandard courses where they're going to get easier A's and higher GPAs. That's not an acceptable solution. That's not equity, right?
Absolutely.
That's window dressing failure, and we need to make sure that our leaders are actually willing to do the hard work to get real results. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for listening. I think this was an incredibly enlightening conversation around some of the other conversations that we've been seeing happening at the state level, across the UC system around this topic. But I want to thank you for your time. I think this was an incredible conversation.
Thanks for this idea.